Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Recent unrest in English and Welsh jails is causing grave concern. That is according to the Prison Governors Association. In an open letter, the president of the organisation said governors were facing unacceptable stress. This letter comes after 2 days of unrest at the Mount establishment in Hertfordshire. Mark Lebel reports.
There have been days of disorder at prisons in Wiltshire and Hertfordshire, where riot-trained officers were deployed to subdue unruly prisoners. This past year has brought an average of 20 attacks a day on staff in prisons in England and Wales, following a decline in the number of prison officers over the past few years and complaints over pay. Now the president of the Prison Governors Association is publicly blaming the government for what she calls a crisis in many jails and unacceptable stress and anxiety amongst workers. In an open letter to prison governors, Andrea Allbutt says the state has failed to help them cope with population pressures in prison, having changed the way the prisons are run for the worse. Ms Allbutt says the government's decision taken earlier this year to separate operational control of the prison system from responsibility for policy was madness, leaving a gaping hole in operational knowledge. The Ministry of Justice says it recognises the long-standing challenges facing prisons and that it's recruiting more officers. But with only 75 more in place since last year, Ms Allbutt said recruitment remains in a critical condition. Mark Lebel, BBC News.
Oh, well, our correspondent Dan Johnson is here. Dan, how bad is it?
Well, this letter makes clear that things really are in a state of crisis, the president of the Prison Governors Association says. And she is very stark in her warning. This is a really strongly worded letter it's an open letter, but directed at the Ministry of Justice, highlighting what she feels that they need to put right. She talks of a crisis. She says there is concerted indiscipline. She says there's a toxic mix which does not have a quick fix, and the future looks like we'll suffer more of the same. She talks about intolerable pressure. She says recruitment remains critical. She talks about the selection process, which is allowing many unsuitable people through. She says the quality of training is poor and that new recruits can actually add to the instability of prisons. She says she's devastated at the complete decline of our service, and that is why, that would seem to be her explanation for why we've seen repeated disorder, particularly just over the last couple of days, repeated disorder at the Mount prison, and we've seen trouble at other prisons too. So I think there is widespread agreement that our prisons are in crisis and that something needs to change.
So it's scathing. And in response to this open letter, what were the Ministry of Justice saying?
We have a statement from the Ministry of Justice. They've addressed this issue that Andrea Allbutt highlighted about the new system they've put in place and the way that they have split operational control with the way that policy is set. Now, they say that the creation of this new prison and probation service was designed to help create a distinct, professionalised frontline service. They say they know that prisons have faced a number of long-standing challenges, which is why they've taken immediate action to boost prison officer numbers, although Andrea Allbutt says that's not increasing quickly enough. They say they need a calm and ordered environment in prison to help ensure effective rehabilitation, but she is clear that is not happening at the minute.
OK, Dan, thank you very much indeed. Now, there are calls for the government to renationalise probation services following what's described as an extremely worrying rise in the number of supervised offenders charged with serious crimes. Figures show an increase in the number of offenders under probation committing serious offences, including murder, manslaughter and rape. Reforms introduced in 2014 saw private firms take over the management of some low and medium risk offenders. So is there a link between the rise in crime and partial privatisation, or is there more to it than that? Well, with us in the studio is Ian Lawrence, who is the General Secretary of NAPO, the National Association of Parole Officers, Bob Turney, a former offender who later became a probation officer, Matt Illick, who works for the charity and social business Catch-22. They provide probation services, and also from Cardiff we can speak to Nadine Marshall, whose son Connor was killed by a man on probation. Welcome to the programme. Ian, let's start with you. Did you see this coming?
Well, our members, and we're a probation association and a trade union as well, so our members who are working under appalling conditions as a result of the privatisation saw this coming a long time ago. We told ministers of that fact. We submitted evidence to Parliament. We were among 500 organisations that foretold problems with the privatisation. Now, it's easy to make the link between serious further offences, and our hearts go out to all the victims of such appalling crimes. But you've got to look deeper than just the figures and look at the operational models that the government has allowed to come into play by some of these private contractors. And there have been countless reports from a Majesty's Inspector of Probation that they're not fit for purpose in many cases.
OK, let me read you the Ministry of Justice statement. They say in 2014 we reformed our approach to probation so that for the first time ever all offenders are given a custodial sentence, receive probation support and supervision on release. It's therefore misleading to compare the number of serious further offences prior to our reforms with subsequent figures, as the number of people on probation is now significantly higher than before. What's your response to that?
Well, they would say that, wouldn't they? They didn't reference the fact that the Probation Inspectorate has described their through-the-gate support system as non-effective, save for a few areas where clearly some good work has been done, as you'll probably hear. But that support scheme for short-term prisoners has manifestly failed because it hasn't been resourced properly. And now the government is throwing £22 million of taxpayers' cash at these failing CRCs with more to follow. And our members are saying, well, how is that going to make an actual difference?
But if you're just looking at the numbers from an outsider's point of view, the main reason more offenders are committing more crimes on probation is because more offenders are now under probation supervision, surely? Well,
you can look at it that way. You could also look at the fact that there are not enough people in the prison who are receiving rehabilitation where it counts, as well as in the community. And the problems in the prisons can't be divorced from what's going on elsewhere. If the system isn't helping people to gear up for return to society, you will see more reoffending and more serious offences.
And also the reforms extended the supervision to everyone serving a sentence of under 12 months. That's the privatisation bit. So previously they weren't supervised, so if they reoffended they wouldn't have been counted in those figures. So we're not really comparing like with like.
No, but we said that they should have been supervised by the probation service before privatisation, but we never got given the money to do it. We never saw these people, as Bob will tell you shortly. So this is a new cohort of people, 40,000 plus, coming out into society with inadequate support and in many cases inadequate supervision as well.
Matt, are there benefits when it comes to privatisation, in your opinion?
Well,
and from your experience?
Sure, if I just start with the figures, I think we work with 10,000 prison leavers in the final 12 weeks of their custodial sentence. And I think for us, it's almost certainly too early to say whether this programme has been a success or failure. The first official statistics are due later this year, and even the government's National Audit Office says it's too early to score. But I think it's absolutely right that there's public scrutiny on these issues. And the reports that a colleague has talked about are absolutely welcome, and I think there are significant problems in the system more widely. In terms of probation, privatisation, outsourcing, we would say that there isn't a right or wrong as to who delivers public services, and we're a charity that's significantly involved in the delivery of public services. And actually some of the best performing probation systems around the world are voluntary. So if I take the Japanese system, the probation service of some 50,000 people mainly consists of volunteers, and indeed the earlier versions of our own probation system was voluntary. So I think there isn't something intrinsic to privatisation that has led to lots of these failures.
So then you don't think nationalising that part of it will solve the problem necessarily?
Exactly. There were issues with probation before. I think we've got some significant structural problems at the moment, both with prisons and probation. You will have seen the news this morning. And I think the more public scrutiny and pressure there is on government to think about what the real issues have been in the operating models and the resourcing of this, that's the really important debate to think about now, as opposed to who's involved in the delivery of this.
And Bob, you spent time going in and out of prison. Then a probation worker helped you turn your life around, get your life together. What did they do?
It was about relationships. You see, I was one of the short-term recidivists. The ones, when I was in the service, weren't getting probation. They came in prison. If they were serving a year or less, they wouldn't see it. But I got a lot of supervision. And, you know, she stayed with me. I mean, we just used to pass them around now. You go, somebody had written a report, somebody's going to do this. There was no relationship. But in my time, there was plenty of relationships, and that's what happened. And when I really did get my act together, she inspired me to go on to become a probation officer, because I knew it worked. But, you know, I jumped ship just as it was going to change over to be Nashta privatised, you know, because it's not the service I had. When I went into the
Why not?
Well, when I went into the service, I was spending 20% of my time writing about the offender and 80% of the time working with the offender. When I left, it was completely reversed. 80% of my time was taken up writing reports and 20% time working with the offender, and that's where it's lost. That's where it's fallen down. And, you know, all right, you've got serious offenders and you've got serious offender, you know, teams working after them, but the short-term recidivists, the ones that take a lot of time up, a lot of energy, I mean, if we, you know, a lot of people ask me, what turns your life round? And I simply say, you know, I've stopped feeling sorry for myself and started feeling sorry for my victims. And that was what we was doing in probation, getting them to grow up and take responsibility.
Do you think, Bob, that you would you be in this position now if, when you were dealing with probation officers, you were dealing with a privatised system?
I don't think so. I'd like to think that I would, but I was getting a tremendous amount of support from probation, a tremendous amount.
OK, let me bring in Nadine into the conversation. Nadine, can you tell us what happened to your son?
Hi, yeah, good morning. My son Connor was 18 and he was in Porthcawl for one night only in March 2015. And he was attacked from behind by a gentleman we now know as David Braddon. Connor subsequently died of his injuries 4 days later, and David Braddon was charged with the murder and has now been sentenced to 20 years in prison.
So your son was killed by a man who was on probation.
Yes.
What do you think about what we are hearing today, the link between serious crime and privatisation?
To be perfectly honest, I'm really angry at the overall sort of responses that are coming, whether it's from the panel or from government departments.
Why are you angry?
There's an awful lot of talk about re-offenders and offending and the support that's given to them. However, at the bottom of this, you have to remember that there are victims and there are victims' families. We don't have that luxury of any support. Any support we find, we have to go looking for it. And don't forget, on top of that, then you're in the midst of possibly a trial or a police investigation, as well as the trauma, as well as the stresses of trying to keep, you know, your ship afloat, when the evidence is there that this system is just failing right from the very top down, and it's not being disseminated in the way that it was supposedly made to transform these lives.
What's your message? What would you like to happen now?
I want change. I want support for families that are having to be included in this horrible offence of a serious offence. I want legislative change right from the top. The system isn't working. It's not fit for purpose at all, and this wasn't the case in 2013, and it isn't the case now.
OK, Nadine, thank you very much for speaking to us. Thank you all as well. Prisons in England and Wales are in crisis after perverse government reform and a toxic mix of pressures. The head of the body representing governors is warning. Andrea Albert wrote an open letter after recent violence at prisons in Hertfordshire and Wiltshire. She says the unrest is causing grave concern, adding that governors faced unacceptable stress and anxiety.
We've had year-on-year austerity measures. Part of those austerity measures was losing 7,000 prison officers, and the staffing levels in prisons are critical, so we're unable to give a decent rehabilitative regime.
Is this simply a case of numbers? Do we just need more prison officers?
I think that's the #1 priority, more people, not always prison officers. We do need more administration staff. But we need to have people so we can stabilise our prisons before we even start considering reforming them.
Well, if that's the #1 concern, the Ministry of Justice has said they are already increasing the numbers.
In the financial year 16 to 17, there was a net increase of 75 prison officers. This year they are ramping things up. The issue we've got is a high attrition rate. So whilst we may well get the numbers in, and there is question around the quality of the people that we're getting into our service, but we aren't keeping them because the environment is so violent in many prisons, and the reward package is not good enough.
So what can be done to solve that, the violence problem?
Well, I think at the moment we just need to control the situation. There is no quick fix. So on a daily basis, prison governors and their teams will be deciding what kind of regime to deliver that will keep the prison safe. Then when we get the staff in, and then start looking at how we strategically move our prisons on and start improving them.
In your open letter, you said that governors faced unacceptable stress and anxiety. Can you give me examples?
Well, I think the best example is the incident, or the two incidents that occurred in the Mount Prison in Hertfordshire over the last couple of days. Because that is not an unusual occurrence. Prisoners gained control of wings and staff withdrew. And so those wings have been damaged and we had to retake those wings.
We've also spoken to a governor who was critical of the fact that the Prison Governors Association didn't intervene when Chris Grayling made cuts to the prison service when he was Justice Secretary. How do you respond to that?
Prison Governors Association was fully involved in all of the consultation of benchmarking, and obviously we did voice our concerns, as we do with everything. But that doesn't necessarily mean to say that we can stop government policy.
Is this too late then? Could you have done more, and should you have spoken out earlier?
No, I don't agree with that. I think we have done as much as we can, and we consistently do this. I think what's interesting at the moment is our Secretary of State, David Lidington. His silence has been deafening on the issue of prisons. He's inherited prisons that are in a significant challenging situation, and he has said nothing. Sam Jima, Prisons Minister, he was our Prisons Minister in the last stint and he's retained that position. He's unable to meet with us until mid-October. So it isn't a case of the Prison Governors Association aren't doing anything, but the government don't seem to be receptive to talking to us.
How bad do you feel the situation is becoming?
Well, the situation, the violence statistics that came out last week were the worst ever. I don't expect them to improve in the next quarter. So the situation is bad. And until we get sufficient staff in our prison, the situation we're in will continue. So we will continue to try and control the situation in our prisons, but we will not be delivering in a significant number of our prisons good quality rehabilitative regimes. We will literally be holding and controlling the people in our care, and this is unacceptable.
OK, well, we can now speak to John Podmore, who used to be the governor of Brixton Prison and several other jails. He's also the author of Out of Sight, Out of Mind, Why Britain's Prisons Are Failing. Good morning.
Good morning.
What's your response to this open letter?
Well, I agree with much of what Andrea is saying, but I stand by my criticism that the Prison Governors Association didn't fight hardly at all, certainly not hard enough, against the benchmarking process, which was the one by which cuts were made. And she's right, there are no quick fixes. We need more prison staff and we need fewer prisoners, but we need a better strategic approach from the PGA, and we're not getting it.
Can you take me through a typical day in the life of somebody who's working at one of these prisons? Can you tell me how bad it is?
Well, I'm not the person to ask, as I'm not currently working in English prisons, but it will be extremely stressful. Prisons work on staff-prisoner relationships. You run prisons on cooperation. And, you know, a good day for a prisoner and a good day for a prison officer is when there's some dialogue, when there's mutual interest, when prisoners have got some investment in the regime, where prison staff are able to engage with prisoners about their difficulties, their resettlement. And those staff-prisoner relationships have broken down, and they've broken down because, you know, as Andrea said, you know, you can't lose 7,500 prison officers with a lot of experience and then try and replace them with 2,500 straight out of the training school. And, you know, the training in this country is the shortest of any jurisdiction that I've ever worked in. So you've got prison officers who are demoralised, demotivated, poorly trained, poorly recompensed, I would say, as well. And they're kind of literally and metaphorically retreating into a corner. The regimes get less and less, so prisoners have, and I think we're seeing this in many of the disturbances, they've got nothing to lose. I mean, the Mount, in the words of the MOJ itself, is a prison for people towards the end of their sentence who are looking to be resettled in the local area. Now, you know, these aren't public enemies number one. You know, these are people about to go back into our communities and live next door to us. Now, you know, the reports I'm reading are that they're locked up sort of 23 hours a day. Now, you know, there is something that is in the gift of prison governors, which is release on temporary licence, which is where prisoners can go out and work in the community, earn some money, prepare for release. Now, you know, that's what should be happening at the Mount, not prisoners being locked up 23 hours a day. Now, you know, I've lost track of the rules and regulations as to whose gift release on temporary licence is, but it should be in the gift of governors. It's governors taking risks, and I'm afraid governors do need to take risks.
Can you tell me about, John, this unacceptable stress and anxiety that Andrea talks about in the letter that governors are facing?
Well, it will be huge. You know, because of this breakdown in relationships, prisons become very, very tense. You know, and governors going in first thing in the morning will be worried, first of all, how many staff are going to turn up. And there are no figures that I've seen recently about staff sickness. I suspect it's very high. You know, Andrea's referred to the turnover. So you've got experienced people going, inexperienced going. So a governor will come in first thing in the morning. How many staff has he got? What kind of regime can he run? And it becomes a bit of a downward spiral. I mean, the fewer staff he's got, or she has got, the less will be the activities for prisoners. The more prisoners get frustrated, the more reluctant prison officers are to unlock them. And we then end up with the situation that we've seen at the Mount and many other prisons.
John, thank you very much for speaking to us this morning.
Now, the president of the Prison Governors Association has published an open letter in which she says prisons in England and Wales are in crisis. Andrea Albert warned of a toxic mix of pressure in jails and the unacceptable stress and anxiety faced by prison officers. It follows 2 days of rioting at the Mount prison in Hertfordshire, which saw special officers called in after inmates took over the wing of a jail. Well, in response, the Ministry of Justice says, we know that our prisons have faced a number of long-standing challenges, which is why we have taken immediate action to boost prison number officers and have created Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service. This will help to create a distinct, professionalised frontline service and will ensure that policy and operations are working closely together to deliver these much-needed reforms. Well, Andrea Albert from the Prisoners Governors Association, who wrote that letter, joins us now. Why did you feel compelled to write it?
Our members in the Prison Governors Association have been contacting us saying the situation in their prisons is intolerable, and there seems to have been a lot of silence around this, and as the President of the Prison Governors Association, I felt absolutely compelled to put this out into the public domain.
But we have covered this story many times over the last just 6 months here on Sky News. We know that conditions in prisons are not ideal. We know that staff are overstretched, and the government must know that too, surely.
Yes, the government do, and it was interesting, the response to my letter from the government in that they are recruiting extra staff. Yes, they are. We lost 7,000 staff in recent years, 7,000 prison officers, and they have given us funding to get 2,500 staff back. But they aren't coming into our prisons soon enough. In the financial year 16 to 17, we had a net increase of 75 prison officers. Yes, things are ramping up this year, but we have a significant attrition rate. So we might be able to get people in, but we're not keeping them. And I think some of that is around the environment, incredibly challenging, and also the pay and reward package.
What about the division of policy and operations? That's something that you highlight in your letter that a lot of people may not have been aware of, that when it comes to the running of a prison, there is a different group of people looking at the overall policy than the people who are actually doing the day-to-day running.
The PGA don't really understand the decision around this. We have a large prison reform programme, and in my open letter I said the size of that. And what we don't understand is that we have got career civil servants deciding policy in a prison, and many of them may well never have stepped foot in a prison before. They may well never have spoken to a prisoner. So in order for the policy to be put into context, they have taken operational experts, that's our grades, they've taken them out of stretched prisons and put them into the Ministry of Justice. So I suppose for me the common sense approach is we've got a very expensive model. Surely it would be sensible to have the operational experts only writing policy.
You mentioned in your letter also that you're looking forward to meeting the Prisons Minister, Sam Gyimeh, in October. Why have you not met him yet?
Well, under the previous government, when we had the Secretary of State Liz Truss, we did meet Sam Gyimeh on a fairly regular basis. He has kept that position, Prisons Minister, and we did expect to see him sooner than the mid-October. And certainly we would expect to see him sooner than that when you look at the crisis that some of our prisons are in.
Have you asked to see him and been refused?
No, we haven't asked to see him. I did expect to see him mid-August, but that's been put back to October.
You also warn in your letter that there is no quick fix. Are you concerned that the conditions in prisons could deteriorate further? You highlight the fact that obviously it's the summer, that there is a lot of holiday being taken by prison officers.
The violence statistics came out, the quarterly violence statistics came out last week, and they showed once again an increase in violence. And until we get adequate staffing and adequate funding of prisons, I don't expect the violence statistics to improve significantly. I'll be hopeful that they don't deteriorate further, but I'm certainly not hopeful that they will improve.
OK, Andrea Albert from the Prison Governors Association, thank you.
The president of the Prison Governors Association has said what she called a perverse government overhaul is to blame for the crisis in jails across England and Wales. In an open letter, she said the prison service is trying to cope with a toxic mix of pressures. The government has said it has taken immediate action to deal with the problems. But Channel 4 News has heard from one former prison monitor who spoke out about the urgent need for prison reform, only, she says, to lose her job for the trouble. Our senior Home Affairs correspondent Simon Israel has this.
Until the end of last year, Faith Spear was chair of the Independent Monitoring Board for Hollesley Bay Prison in East Anglia. Her role was to ensure standards were met in the day-to-day care for those inside. Then she spoke out about the constraints on speaking out about the crisis behind the walls.
I mean, I was bullied, then ostracised. I was investigated by the Ministry of Justice.
And this is all because you were publicly critical?
I spoke out for prison reform, yes.
The letter says you revealed official classified information.
The only classified information that I can even think that they're talking about is this suspension letter that said official sensitive on it. Certainly that, and I put it out on social media because I couldn't believe that they would suspend me. They're speaking out for wanting things to change and change for the better. It's ridiculous.
In January this year, the Prisons Minister, Sam Gyimeh, sacked her, and she was banned for 5 years from serving on any board. In a letter, he said, "You have failed to comply with agreed policies and procedures. You have also failed to comply with the standards expected of public appointees."
Why do you think they went that far?
Because they wanted to silence me. They didn't want anyone else to take the same route that I had. They probably realised that there was grave things going on within the prison service, but they didn't want the IMB to be the one that spoke out.
But the IMB is supposed to be independent.
It's not independent, not at all. It's a department of the Ministry of Justice.
The MOJ has released little detail of this week's volatile events at Mount Prison when inmates took over parts of the jail. Channel 4 News understands one of the disturbances followed a standoff between 2 prison officers and inmates armed with weapons. This has not been confirmed, but the latest prison unrest has prompted an open letter from the Prison Governors Association's president, Andrea Albert, in which she talks of a crisis and the madness of the MOJ's response. Governors, she said, have seen nothing tangible from a rapid recruitment drive.
They say that the selection process is allowing many unsuitable people through and the quality of training is poor. It has been said that large numbers of new recruits can actually add to the instability in prisons rather than improve it.
But for Faith Spear, it's all about the official silence.
But I want to encourage people, if they see things that are not right, speak it, say it. It can't be hidden. Lives are at risk. There's a lot going on that we're not aware of. There's a lot of unrest, a lot of things bubbling up. I mean, now we're seeing with the riots, no one looks to, what's the cause of it, it's just how to punish them for taking part.
No minister was available for interview. The MOJ said in a statement it recognised the need to create calm and ordered environments and added it's working closely with all staff to achieve vital reforms.
So if you were in government and thinking about how to cut public spending, prisons would perhaps seem like a no-brainer. Prison cuts don't appear to affect many people and prisoners themselves can't even vote. It's that logic which perhaps explains why there are now only 42,000 staff in the National Offender Management Service in England and Wales, while there were 49,000 back in 2010. But the logic of cutting prisons has perhaps reached a limit. The pressure of fewer staff in overcrowded jails has seen violence rise towards staff, towards other prisoners, or in the form of self-harm. Bad things are happening in our jails, and it is no surprise that the president of the Prison Governors Association has written an open letter attacking the government's management of prisons. Here's Elaine Dunkley.
Man, a riot in HMP Birmingham.
Violence and rioting. Volatility has gripped prisons in England and Wales.
Run!
The pressure in our prison service building for staff and inmates. A breakdown in law and order caused by a shortage of staff and a growing prison population.
Spice in a jailhouse.
A toxic mix, according to the Prison Governors Association. Attacks on prison staff, a drugs epidemic, increasing concern around mental health and overcrowding, reform, resources, rehabilitation, all major issues for our prison service. Many are warning the system is at breaking point. Earlier this week, specialist teams known as Tornado units were called into HMP The Mount in Hertfordshire following a riot. And it didn't stop there. At Earlstoke Jail in Wiltshire, there was also disturbances which resulted in violence against staff.
What I would suggest the Secretary of State does is very seriously consider an appeal to staff who have left recently, experienced staff, through voluntary exit schemes to create a task force to go back into those prisons causing the most concern and get back control and create a regime and create stability. If that is insufficient, I would suggest that you need extra resources sent into prison simply to stabilise them short term, and you could consider, for example, using the army for that. It's a very radical measure, it's a controversial measure, and it does carry some risk. But the risks of doing nothing are simply too high, in my view, to not at least consider exceptionally and for a short period of time getting resources onto the landings to restore order and control.
There has been a sharp rise in prison violence. Latest figures show nearly 27,000 assaults in prisons in the year to March. That's 20% more than last year. This includes more than 7,000 attacks on staff, equating to 20 a day.
I think there has to be some humility, frankly, from government to say, we made a catastrophic mistake here in reducing staff so far and so fast. There is a systemic and widespread instability in prisons, and unless it is tackled, I really do fear that we're going to see a member of staff killed on duty.
Recruitment and retaining prison staff is a major problem. Over the last 12 months, there has been a net increase of just 75 officers. Meanwhile, the prison population in England and Wales is growing. Mark, you've worked with prisoners and ex-offenders for more than 20 years. How bad is this situation?
This is possibly the worst that it's been, I think, for probably 30 years or so. We've seen
Mark Blake is pushing for urgent reform, something he's been calling for since the infamous Strangeways riots in the 1990s. He believes too many are being put behind bars.
I think the violence is a symptom of the reductions that we've had in prison staff, the amount of time that people are being locked in their cells, the deterioration in terms of mental health that's contributing to. We need to address this issue of groups of people who are in the system who we can divert elsewhere. We'd highlight women. You know, the women's prison population is at an all-time high, I think, for the last 20 years. And people with mental health problems. We need to be able to do a lot more.
How long will prison reform take? From prison staff to the inmates who are locked away, the problems are clear to see for those caught in a system that needs urgent rehabilitation.
Elaine Dunkley there. Well, I'm joined now by Paula Harriott, who spent 4 years in jail for supplying drugs, that was some years back, but who now works hands-on with people in prison for the organisation Revolving Doors. Paula, how have you seen it change, say, in the last 5 to 10 years?
You've seen how the impact of having less staff and more people in prison is really impacting on the ability to deliver any rehabilitation in prisons. It's become about warehousing people and warehousing people who come into that prison unwell, you know, with mental health problems, substance misuse problems, all sorts of challenges.
No rehabilitation or less rehabilitation. What does that mean? Is it more hours locked in a cell?
It means locked in your cell.
For how many? What are we?
Some people. We are seeing cases of people, because of staff shortages, being locked up the entire weekend from Friday through till Monday, and I mean that is simply traumatising for people. Imagine just not being able to get out at all, and how that plays on your ability to cope with the stress of the sentence. You can't access the phone to phone anybody, you're isolated, and how that really impacts on your mental health.
Yeah. And a lot of people would say, hang on a minute, what did you expect? You're in prison. You know, that is what you get when you go to prison.
I agree, but I think that the punishment is being deprived of your liberty. I don't think it's being placed in degrading situations that are actually not helpful for your long-term rehabilitation.
Now, how does the violence come around? I mean, this is a sort of rather stupid question, really, but obviously people locked in cells are not going to be getting up to any violence because there's nothing for them to do.
But the frustration builds and builds and builds and escalates, doesn't it? So then when people do, you can't hold people constantly.
So when they get out.
So when you get out, the anger and the frustration is absolutely at the tipping point and at the boiling point, and then people just flare up over things that generally could be managed in a different way.
Have you witnessed any violence or fights or things in prisons? You go and visit prisoners?
I've been working since my own release from prison. I've been working constantly in prisons and working directly with people who have been recently released from prison, having lots of contact. And I can see that the breakdown in communication, the breakdown in access to mental health services, to substance misuse services, to psychological interventions, how staffing levels mean people can't get to health care.
You mentioned substance misuse. The one substance people are allowed to misuse, but will be stopped from doing so, is tobacco. The smoking ban seems to be causing worry.
And that is really, you know, I think misjudged. I think that in my information that I've had recently around the smoking ban has been that people are then using spice and they are smoking it without tobacco, so it's it's unadulterated. So the impact of that has been that it's escalated people's mental ill health and violence levels.
Very, very briefly, the public want people to be punished. They want you supplying drugs. They want you to be punished for that. You've got 4 years. What is the alternative? Many people say you can't put that many people in jail. What could we have done to signal disapproval in the way that we did with women?
I just recently spoke to a magistrate about how we can minimise the amount of people that are being sent to prison, and her answer was that we need a menu of options for magistrates, that sometimes magistrates and judges run out of options. They run out of options to support people in the community to look at their offending behaviour. They don't have the ability to sentence people to mental health treatment or they don't utilise that as much as they could. They don't have the option to direct people to substance misuse treatment orders. So I think we need to have a much more coherent approach to using community sentencing to divert people out of the criminal justice system.
Thank you very much indeed for helping us with that. Well, I'm joined now by Philip Wheatley, who's formerly Director General of the National Offender Management Service, also former Director General of HM Prison Service, also the Conservative MP Dominic Grieve, who was Attorney General under the coalition government. A very good evening to you both. Phil Wheatley, would you say it's crisis level in terms of violence and inability to serve the prisoners in the way you're meant to?
Yes, I think it's genuinely a crisis to see a tripling in the rate of assaults on staff since I left in 2010. Means that it's very difficult for staff to do their job safely and properly. That makes them likely to back off from enforcing rules in the face of that sort of aggression. That in its turn makes it more difficult to run prisons safely. The level of assaults between prisoners, the extent to which spice has become the drug of choice and is very difficult to deal with, and now a series of incidents, mass disorder, that genuinely should be called a crisis. And I haven't mentioned suicide, which is the other big change. It's about doubled since I left. And that means that prisons are genuinely unsafe for both prisoners and for staff, and they're not doing the job that they should be doing for the country by reducing reoffending in the way that they should be able to.
Dominic Grieve, we've heard a lot of testimony this evening that that is the state of things. Do you recognise that is the state of jails in England and Wales?
Yes, I do. I think the evidence is overwhelming. The basic problem is that we have an overcrowded prison system, and we have failed consistently to face up to that, to accept that we've either got to reduce the prison population or we've got to provide more prisons and more prison officers. And whilst leadership in good prisons can do a great deal to reduce some of those issues, even if you have a shortage of staff, there does come a point where you can't go on doing that. And the message I think the government has to take from this is that either there has to be substantial more investment and money being spent, or progressively we have got to find alternatives to prison to reduce the prison population. We fail completely to face up to this. And I, as a politician, get bombarded by people asking for prison sentences to be increased or for new criminal offences to be created, which are going to lead to people being sent to prison. We have a knack in this country of seeing prison as the proper and final destination for criminals and insisting that's where they should go. We have one of the highest prison populations in Europe per head, and we don't have the resources invested in order to deal with that.
Dominic Grieve, this is quite an indictment of your party in government, isn't it? I mean, they've been there for 7 years. They've been talking the talk. Michael Gove, I mean, he said this is appalling. There's no point in trying to minimise or divert attention away from the problems we face. And yet it hasn't been dealt with, for goodness sake. Why not?
It isn't an indictment of the present government. It's an indictment of every single government that's been in office for as long as I've been in Parliament. This is a long-standing problem. And in fairness, the present Justice Secretary, who I think is a wise and sensible person, has understood some of those issues, and in the decisions that have been taken to invest in getting more prison officers back in, that's a step in the right direction, but it can only be a step. Ultimately, we put people into prison, and unless we have proper training and proper educational programs, then what we're actually doing is putting a group of people with serious problems and also a serious tendency to criminality all together in one place. So should we be surprised in those circumstances if we can't deliver the programs that, in fact, they end up misbehaving within the prison system itself?
Phil Wheatley, we heard Ian Aitchison in the package we've just played basically say if you can't get the resources in, you just need to have the army ready wherever there's disruption, which I think he thinks there'll be quite a bit, the army ready to step in. I mean, have we really reached that point in this country?
I think that would be a way of making the situation worse, is my view. The prison's ability to handle disorder when it occurs and to end that disorder without injury to either staff or prisoners is quite considerable. They're really skilled at doing it, and they're succeeding in doing that. The army are not trained for that. To deploy them in that role would be folly. To deploy them to supervise wings where they've had no training for doing it, their training is in use of force, lethal force, not persuading people to do things. So it would be, in my view, make the situation much worse. But there is a crisis, and we do have to deal with it.
Well, and Phil, they have announced there will be more prison officers. I think it's 2,500 or 3,000 extra prison officers in England and Wales, because everybody's recognised it's not good enough. Will that make the difference that is required?
It will help if they can recruit them. Part of the problem is that the government pay policy, which has forced down the cost of pay for prison officers, so they earn less than they used to when I was there, is making the job unattractive, particularly in the southeast, where the economy is running fairly hot and we have full employment. And so it's proving difficult to recruit, and the churn rate has gone up. So whereas in my time about 2% of staff left a year, arguably that wasn't enough, it's now running just short of 10% of staff a year. That means you've got to recruit very hard to stand still. So I think we need to do something about both the attraction and the retention strategy, and sticking doggedly to government pay policy looks as though it's getting in the way of that, particularly in the London and the South East.
Quick final one to you, Dominic Grieve. What happens if we don't grasp this, don't put in the extra resources and don't cut prison numbers? What happens if we do nothing?
I think the consequence is going to be that our prison system is going to continue to be as well run as possible, but occasionally chaotic. And the other thing is the rehabilitation that we actually want from the prison system for the vast majority of inmates who are going to be coming out after reasonably short periods of time is going to be completely lost. So it is very much in our interest to try and get this right. But I think I may come back to my original point, which is the greatest driver is overcrowding. And as long as we cannot, as a society, get a grip on this, then we're constantly going to be behind the curve. We're not going to be able to try and address this issue. It's going to be crisis management all the time. I mean, I've taken an interest in this subject for as long as I've been in Parliament, which is 20 years. And throughout this period, these problems have been in the background continuously. And the main feature of the last 20 years is that the prison population has gone up by a third.
Dominic Grieve, Phil Weekly, thank you both very much.